From records and cassettes to CDs, MP3s, and streaming, there are now more ways than ever to listen to music. While streaming on platforms like Spotify and Apple Music may be the most common and convenient way to listen to your favorite songs, there are concerns over how these platforms operate. Algorithms that dictate what is popular, inconsistent payment methods for artists, and questionable use of user data all bring up questions about our favorite music streaming apps. Mid-Continent Public Library is proud to be hosting a conversation with author Liz Pelly and Michelle Bacon from 90.9 The Bridge for a discussion of Liz's new book, Mood Machine, The Rise of Spotify and the Costs of the Perfect Playlist. They will discuss how the current state of music streaming affects both the artists that create music and everyone who listens using these popular platforms.
MCPL keeps you up to date on the rapidly evolving technological advancements growing ever present in our lives. If you're interested in learning more about emerging technologies, be sure to check out our digital innovation page using the link in the description. There, you can find more information and register for upcoming classes and special events that explore the wins and challenges these new technologies provide. Welcome to Mid-Continent Public Library and the kickoff event for our second year of the Facing the Future Speaker Series. My name is Erin Kennedy. I'm the Digital Innovation Manager at MCPL, and it's my great pleasure to be with you this evening. We have author Liz Pelly here along with Michelle Bacon for tonight's conversation. But before we begin, I want to mention just a few housekeeping items. So first of all, if you got a book out in the lobby, we're going to have a book signing after the program. So please join us in the lobby to meet Liz after the program if you're interested in doing that. Also, just for your information, tonight's event is being recorded. We are going to post this event online afterwards for anyone who wasn't able to make it or if you want to watch it again. So be on the lookout for that. We kindly ask that you silence all of your mobile devices, please, just to ensure we can all enjoy the discussion without any disruptions. And tonight's program is going to feature 45 minutes of conversation, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. You'll come up to these mics. I'd now like to welcome Mid-Continent Public Library Director Aaron B. Mason to the stage. So please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Aaron. How's everybody doing tonight? Show of hands. If this is your first time here, raise your hand. Okay, very good. So I say this to everybody. So you're here at Woodneath, right? It's a beautiful branch library. We have something called a mission enhancement here. The Story Center is in that historic home. And within our system, there's 4 of these types of locations. We have a Midwest Genealogy Center, we have a culinary center over at the Green Hills branch, and we have Square One Small Business. These libraries are beautiful. I'm sure you'd agree, right? But if you're not, if you're from here and you've never seen anything to compare it to, you think, oh, all libraries are like this. And I assure you that if you travel the country, they're not. That we have a real gem here. A little factoid: there was a time when libraries in Mississippi were funded through a tax on catfish. I think the state of Michigan peeled off a little parking ticket and speeding ticket money to fund their libraries. So you can imagine, you travel the country and sometimes libraries are beautiful like the ones we have here, and sometimes maybe they have a little ways to go. So cherish what you have and support your library, and just be honored to live in the Kansas City metro area because we have a beautiful library system here. Just a quick note of thanks to the programming staff and Erin and her team for putting on this event. It takes a lot to make these things happen, and we're very appreciative of their support. And this series in particular it matters a lot to me. I think it's important that we come together and talk about technology and how it affects our lives. About Spotify specifically, I could tell you a little story. I was having difficulty sleeping one night, and I thought, well, I'm going to go to Spotify and plug in like music to sleep to, I think it was. And it worked. It was great. But what ended up happening is it polluted my algorithm. So all my Discover Weeklies and stuff was like wind chimes and just people whispering into the mic. and it took me forever to make it go away. And my good friend Amelia in back gave me a pro tip. So listen here, if your timeline's all messed up, she said, if you want sleeping music or white noise, search a podcast and it won't affect your music algorithm. But yeah, so that's my Spotify story. So we're going to learn a lot about the algorithms that shape our taste and fuel Spotify, and that's exciting. And we also have a wonderful moderator tonight. Tonight's moderator is passionate advocate for Kansas City's music scene. Her name's Michelle Bacon. She's the content manager at 90.9 The Bridge. She's a musician, and she's performed and recorded with over 30 local and touring acts. She's dedicated her career to elevating local artists and the arts community, and we're very thankful that she chose to join us tonight. And our honored guest speaker tonight is Liz Pelly. Liz is a contributing editor at The Baffler, and her insightful essays and reporting have appeared in The Guardian, Harper's, NBR, Rolling Stone, Pitchfork, and many other outlets. She teaches recorded music program at New York University and has spent over a decade involved in all ages show booking. Her new book, which you'll learn about tonight, Mood Machine, takes a critical look at music streaming services and their impact on artists, listeners, and the music industry as a whole. So let's give them a big round of applause and welcome them to the stage. All right, thank you.
Hello, Liz. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for the great introduction. And thank you so much to Erin and Brad for all of the work putting this together. And thanks, Michelle, for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. So you flew in this morning from Brooklyn, right?
I did, yes. Yeah. First time in Kansas City.
Yes, welcome to Kansas City.
Hopefully not the last.
Yeah, for sure. So I wanted to kind of start by talking about your background. So you've worked in DIY music spaces, underground music spaces in New York and other places. Curious, like, what first got you interested in the independent music scene?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, as you point out, the first sentence of the book talks about how when I started writing this book, I was working at a DIY music venue. And I actually had some reservations about even starting the book that way because one question I had was, will people even know what that means? So just like to clarify, this is a music venue where a lot of the people who were involved in running this space also lived there, and it was run by a collective, largely volunteer run, and importantly, it was also all ages. So this is sort of like a glimpse into the kinds of music communities that I've been part of, and also a lot of other people for whom like independent music kind of becomes the social fabric of your life. And it's really interesting thinking about like what initially gets you involved in scenes like this or in practices like this, because I don't think it's ever sort of like necessarily there's one thing. One framework that I like for thinking about it is that being involved in independent DIY music is something that I think just inherently like makes sense. Like when you're a kid, you get involved in going to all ages shows because you can't go to 21 plus shows. For me, like throughout my 20s, being involved in DIY booking was, of course, like driven by ideology and values, but also, to do shows in people's houses meant that I could give more money to the touring bands than if I booked them at venues that cost $300 to book. And I think that, for me, like now, being involved in these communities or in this practice has a lot to do with just like really valuing the participatory nature of music and wanting to sort of contribute to protecting that.
So were you involved in these scenes before you started becoming a music journalist, or was it kind of all converging at the same time?
Yeah, I'm someone who has always kind of had like one foot in the world of journalism. I started writing about music as a teenager for my local alt weekly newspaper. Alt weeklies have kind of been like an important influence, trying to sort of keep the alt weekly spirit of journalism alive as much as possible. And then also like having a foot in the world of like music and booking and participating in independent music. And I think that kind of in some ways plays out in, wanting to do a form of music journalism that is really critical of power and trying to think about frameworks for kind of interrogating power in culture that hold up today.
Sure, and that has a lot to do with what we're going to be talking about today. And I wanted to do this little bit of preamble just to so everyone can kind of get to know you as well as what that structure looks like, because anyone who's not necessarily in those scenes doesn't understand like the idea of community that comes from that. And this is something we're going to talk about a little bit later as well, but like music blogs and zines and all of those things that have helped kind of elevate independent artists. And before we start talking about that, though, I do want to talk about a new podcast that you recently launched called Critical Listening. And I think you've only put one episode out so far. And so it's about music, tech, and culture. So why should anyone here who's reading your book or interested in music in any way, why should they listen to this?
Well, one thing that is really important to me as a music journalist contributing to conversations around music and technology is writing from, a pro-labor perspective. I think so for years, something that has really baffled me has been like this reality that a lot of writing that happens about the music business and music technology, which is also writing about the music business, rarely ever centers the voices of artists. And I think for a while I was sort of like confused about this, like why don't music journalists who are writing about the business ever want to seek out the perspectives of musicians? And it's because most writing about the music business is written in a very like pro-business way, not in like a pro-artist or pro-labor way. So that's one of the goals with the program. One of the things that I tried to do in the book was interview as many musicians as I could. The book is based on interviews with over 100 sources. A lot of those sources are people who work in the music business, people who worked at independent record labels, former Spotify employees, but also a lot of artists. And in a lot of ways, I think that's kind of maybe what differentiates it from a more standard approach to music business reporting.
Sure. And as a fellow independent musician who works in that sphere, I think that's a thing that a lot of us talk about a lot is the business side, like contending with the business side in terms of like, well, are we artists or are we content creators or are we, creating press releases? Like how much do we devote to the creative side as opposed to the business side? And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I can understand why a lot of people who write about art like aren't interested in writing about the music business. There definitely were some points in reporting this book that were, I would just say, like kind of sad moments of sort of being immersed in the kind of logic of not just like the major label approach to music, but also just kind of the, tech entrepreneur approach to music distribution and just like a really kind of way of thinking about music that is so antagonistic to so many of the values that people who are involved in independent and underground music have. So there are parts where I was like, wow, I get why no one wants to write about this. This is like really depressing, kind of bleak. But I also think it's important, something that I also said in that first episode of the Critical Listening show is that the reality is that we do, exist in a moment where 600 million people around the world listen to music on Spotify. Most people who listen to music through some sort of digital platform. And I think that when you have, a music industry that is so tied up in these tech companies, it's important to have writers and critics who are dedicated to investigating them and investigating them with artists' interests in mind, and also, listeners' interests in mind too, because the book looks at the impact of streaming on musicians, and it has a perspective on the relationship between creative labor and capital, and the way that musicians have been squeezed by tech companies. But a lot of this book is also looking at the impact of these systems on listeners and what it means to be a listener in an era of surveillance capitalism, or to be doing the bulk of listening through platforms that are recording not just every single piece of your listening history, but every click you make on the platform, every playlist you make, every title, every word you type in, and not just, recording it for the purposes of making their own product stronger, but also then taking all of that information to the data marketplace and to data brokers that endeavor to paint a broader picture of you as a consumer, but also as a person. So there are sort of these like bigger consequences for listeners too.
Yeah. And so before we start really getting into the meat of the Spotify discussion, I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of how people have consumed music in the past, because I didn't, there might be people of all ages here that don't remember a time before streaming. So like just a brief overview on how people have consumed music before streaming.
Yeah, I mean, something that's really interesting about writing a book about the state of recorded music also is that it involves contending with the reality that actually recorded music is a fairly new phenomenon in the broader history of music as an art form. So, there are moments of the book where I go back to the dawn of recorded music, and especially in thinking about the influence of mood music or mood playlists on listening today, going back and realizing like, oh yeah, organizing music by mood is something that, the Thomas Edison Company was also doing at the dawn of the, recorded music industry, or when consumers were being sold, vinyl records for the first time. But to kind of look, specifically at like the prehistory of streaming in a more recent sense, I think the book's prehistory in some ways like sort of starts in the late 90s, in the because in a lot of ways when we think about the history of streaming or how a company like Spotify rose to the position that it's in now, it kind of starts with Napster in some ways. Of course, I would say that the rise of Napster also, or file sharing more broadly, has to do with music industry greed that preceded it, that, created a reality in which music listeners, felt that this is what made more sense. But yeah, so before streaming, we had MP3s, and it was really interesting thinking back on that period of time as someone for whom MP3 blogging was such an important part of how I discovered music as a young person. I always say I wouldn't be here writing about music, writing this book, if it wasn't for the era of file sharing, because that was a huge part of how I kind of had the world of music sort of cracked open in some ways. But yeah, I would say the defining sort of characteristic of that mid 2000s, early 2010s era had a lot to do with you had this whole landscape of independent MP3 blogs where it's just a individual music writer, or not even necessarily a music writer, just music fan, who was posting enthusiastically about music that they were interested in, and then offering a free MP3 download along with that. And it was when I was in college, that was the MP3 blog era, and I have very vivid memories of preparing my college radio shows. You would basically just have your list of music blogs, maybe 20 music blogs that you knew posted stuff that you were interested in, have a million tabs open, and then it would just be clicking through all the tabs from all the recent posts of all of your favorite MP3 blogs, downloading a ton of MP3s, and then just sifting through them, deciding which ones you're gonna play on your college radio show. And yeah, remembering that era of music, I think, is interesting because it is kind of, not historicized in the same way that, maybe the CD or cassette or college radio eras of independent music have been.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I was involved in that scene, I was writing music blogs at the time and playing music, and I never really thought of it as part of that cultural zeitgeist until I read your book, because it kind of happened between the Napster era and when streaming started to take effect. So I thought that was really interesting, and it also provided this thriving ecosystem for independent artists that isn't really there anymore.
Yeah, that was a really interesting point in reporting the book, interviewing people who worked at independent record labels in the kind of late 2000s, early 2010s, realizing I didn't even necessarily think of it this way at the time, but the music blog landscape, part of what made it so, I think, interesting and like vital was that it was a media ecosystem that sort of existed for independent music. Like I hadn't really even at the time, it didn't even really dawn on me as a music blogger myself at the time that, you know, major labels like were not okay with the music blog ecosystem and they were actually fighting it. And it was because of that, it was sort of like a system that existed for independent music. And that is something that's really interesting about like, you know, the rise of streaming, something that I try to trace in the chapter of the book where I'm looking at the prehistory of streaming is that, you know, the rise of streaming, one of the other consequences of it is that it also coincided with the time where independent music in some ways was kind of like, maybe not losing its own media ecosystem, but the media that served independent music was sort of being diminished, whether it be like the independent music blog sphere or the world of alt weeklies, which like also, you know, I think 2011 was when Spotify launched in the United States, and it was only a couple of years later that the like alt weeklies sort of had like their peak moment of the highest number of alt weeklies existing in the country, and it's kind of been like a downward slope since then. And you know, alt weeklies being publications that have really historically served independent, local, underground music. And I can't say that I think anything has ever like really fully replaced both like the blog era or the blog landscape and the alt weekly landscape for independent music journalism. But it's, I think, you know, yeah, looking at these issues of streaming like through a media lens is really important. We tend to think about the impacts of streaming more from the perspective of like how they're impacting the monetization of music and artists' ability to make a living. And I think that it kind of clarifies a lot when you think of it as not just like a financial issue, but also like a media issue too.
Yeah, like media consolidation and how there's just less access to a lot of things that people would want to discover. And, you know, that really goes back to the whole model of this platform and social media platforms and how it's kind of, you know, taking you in a certain direction and giving you this illusion that, but you're choosing it, you know. So we can start talking a little bit about Spotify. You know, it was not the first streaming model for music by any means, but it was the first successful model. And you'd mentioned that there's a 2012 study that talked about how music serves different functional and emotional roles. How did that study inform where Spotify started, how they became successful, and how they evolved?
So I think that's something that kind of helps put this into context is that, you know, Spotify launched in the United States in 2011. It had launched in parts of Europe in 2008. And for the first, from 2008 up until around 2013, not just Spotify, but the idea of a streaming service in general, these platforms were a lot more like search bars. You know, you'd have to know what artist or album you were looking for when you went to a streaming service. And as I write in the book, you know, in the early days of Spotify, even the CEO, Daniel Ek, who is kind of like, you know, independent music's #1 villain. But apparently, you know, even he was opposed to the idea of streaming services being these really curated services. And there's this quote from him talking about how, Spotify is like the Google of music. Of course, I talk in the book about how it doesn't necessarily mean that it's like a more fair, equitable platform. But there wasn't this idea of, an official curated Spotify playlist. So something that has been a really interesting area of research for me is like the concept of the Spotify playlist. Because when I first started researching Spotify, I wasn't a Spotify user, but I think just being a person who is concerned with these questions of media literacy, there were a lot of conversations that were happening about the impact of streaming on musicians, but there were less conversations happening about the impact of streaming on listeners or users. So I started to kind of look at the front page of the app and this, the types of playlists that were being recommended or the sorts of stuff you would just see when you opened this app and thinking like, okay, like why is this what pops up when you open Spotify? Like, there must be some sort of way in which the major labels are influencing this. And I kind of used the front page interface as an entryway into the story, interviewing. So the first article that I did, I interviewed some anonymous major label digital marketing staffers and just asked them to explain to me, like, how are the labels influencing this? And, why is this the playlist that I see when I open this app? Writing the book, required kind of like going back in time and thinking, okay, so in 2013, when Spotify, acquired this company, in 2013, Spotify acquired this company called Tunigo that was a ready-made playlist app, and kind of incorporated their staff into the Spotify staff, and that became the first official Spotify editorial team, where all of a sudden so much more of the experience of being a streaming user was starting to revolve around these curated playlists and eventually also algorithmic playlists and sort of AI-driven recommendations. So this was a question I was sort of posing to people while I was doing the reporting, interviewing former employees, people who worked in the music business at the time. And yeah, in one of the interviews that I did with someone who was close to the company at the time, it came up that, after they launched in the United States in 2011, they had more competition. There was, Spotify wasn't the first streaming service to launch in the US. There was this other streaming service called Rhapsody. There was Pandora. The major labels had tried to start their own streaming services as well. So they were kind of looking to, have a competitive edge, figure out how to expand their user base and get past what they call, in the tech industry, they call early adopters and reach a more mainstream audience. So as this person explained in this interview, Spotify commissioned a research agency to basically study its users and figure out how people were actually using the app. And what it revealed was that, whereas maybe at first Spotify thought of their position as kind of an alternative to iTunes or, like a fully stocked iTunes library, but with the music streaming through the internet, that actually more people were going for like what they call a lean back experience to, click a playlist that says, study jazz or chill morning or whatever. So according to the interviews that I did after they did this research, they started to kind of like optimize for that type of more lean back listener. And yeah, the third chapter of my book is called Selling Lean Back Listening, and it's kind of, I think a defining phenomenon of the streaming era is the not just rise of this way of listening, because streaming didn't invent the concept of passive listening or the lean back listener. In some ways, you could think of the history of commercial radio as a sort of history of lean back listening or passive listening. I talk in the book about the history of Muzak also as kind of another interesting prehistory to streaming, kind of neo-Musakification of all music in some ways. But yeah, that's kind of a bit about that study.
Yeah, and I think a lot about passive listening in terms of live music as well. So when you're an original band, you can play a show to, let's say 20 to 50 people, but then if you go see a cover band, which there's nothing wrong with cover bands, but it's, it's serving people that maybe aren't trying to seek out music, But in terms of like this sort of lean back listening, I think that this curation through the editorial playlisting has really prioritized that way, and hence the title of the book being Mood Machine. Tell me a little bit about that and in terms of like the hierarchy, which, you can also go back and say that that relates a lot to commercial music, commercial radio in terms of like, well, this song is going to be rising up the Billboard Top 100 charts, or we're going to test this song in this category, and then if it does well, it's going to move up in the charts the next week. So I see a lot of parallels between those things and how the editorial playlists were created.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, even the concept of the playlist, I think that there's been a lot of work done by streaming services to try to brand playlist as sort of the streaming era equivalent of the mixtape, but something that I think is interesting is that the word playlist actually comes from commercial radio, and that the concept of the playlist in the roots of radio has to do more with like a radio station, communicating to a DJ what they're supposed to be playing, and perhaps even engineered so in a way to minimize the risk that a listener to a radio station will turn off the radio station. And it is really interesting writing this book. I think of kind of streaming editorial playlists, that the ecosystem of algorithmic recommendation as, in some way, for streaming services, these are kind of like risk management tools of the attention economy. For a company like Spotify, they make their money through selling subscriptions. They have your attention as a subscriber. Their most profitable move is just to make sure that you don't cancel your subscription. And one of the ways in which they can kind of like assert their value to you in your everyday life is just through how much time you spend listening to the app in a given day. So I think in some ways, the ecosystem of, okay, how are we going to like study our users, feed them music that works well enough in the background, that's just novel enough so that they don't get bored, but just risk-free enough that they won't hit skip, they won't turn the app off and go listen to something else, is like another manifestation of radio logic in some ways, I think.
Yeah. And to me, that kind of shows that this lean back listening idea, it totally changes the way listeners engage with music, because it makes music into more of this, like, as opposed to being an art form, it's more of a function, it's a utility. Artists are no longer creatives, they are content creators, and it kind of also disregards other ways people listen. Like, if you're in this room, you probably are a music lover, you probably are out there trying to discover music in whatever ways you can, and Spotify doesn't really account for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the concept of the mood playlist that's explored a lot through this book in some ways is just sort of a way of kind of taking music and reimagining it as like a new type of media product that reduces the chances that they're going to lose you as a listener. But there's so many other ways of contextualizing music beyond that. I think in the streaming era, there's a lot of these conversations around like mood versus genre, like the record stores used to organize music by genre, and that was so limiting. And now it is like so much more progressive that music gets sorted by mood. But there's also, like, from my perspective, what streaming services have come up with are just like new ways of narrativizing the concept of audience segments. And I think that's totally like, what mood and vibe-based playlist categories are. If you were to listen to streaming services, Spotify playlist executives and programming executives, when they talk about these kind of more mood and vibe-based playlists that kind of, define the streaming landscape now, they talk about like organizing around listening communities, but that's like kind of a sort of corporate jargon way of saying like we look at data and we curate around like data clusters, and that is also a jargony way of saying like we pinpoint you as a demographic or as an audience segment, and then we like suggest music to you based on which audience segment, which it's just classic marketing tactics.
Right, but then it's shopped to you as like this hyper personalized thing where it's like only you are getting this specific playlist.
Yeah.
But then you go in and look at some of these playlists and it's like, wait, I already have heard these songs a million times. They're just being packaged in a different box.
Mm-hmm. And that's where the kind of shift to hyper-personalization, I think, it becomes so interesting to think about it in the context of so much of marketing historically just relying on this idea of making consumers feel like individuals, like buy this product so that you feel like an individual. And in some ways, taking your taste profile, which is the phrase that Spotify uses to describe its data that it has on you. So, this data log of all of the music you've listened to, kind of data-ified into different buckets is your taste profile. Taking your taste profile, just the music you're statistically likely to not hit skip on, and then figuring out ways to put it into all of these different buckets, and pitching it to you as this kind of like hyper-personalized offering is kind of just a way of feeding into that sort of like, classic marketing language of like, you're such an individual, you're so unique, like here's your chill, crying, sad coffee mix that is like made for you. But yeah, something that I talk about in the book is how actually, I spent a lot of time while writing this book just kind of like clicking around the interface, looking at all of these different playlists that are being sort of like packaged and sold back to a user, and was really struck by how often I would be looking through all these niche mixes, and it would be like morning mix, sad morning mix, crying mix, coffee, sad morning, crying mix, and then I would click on all of them, and like they basically have all of the same music on them. It's just like the same indie rock songs. Which is pretty interesting, I think. It's kind of like a classic sort of illusion of choice, to kind of allude to another kind of classic marketing tactic also. But what's so interesting is that, these marketing tactics are then just sort of being filtered through this, lens of personalization pointed towards you as an individual, which is, I think, maybe, unique to this era.
Yeah, and it's all through mining your data, basically. And so they started at this place of like, okay, we're going to have these editorial playlists. Users can generate their own playlists. And then we take this data and turn it into algorithms, right? And I wanted to go back a little bit and talk about the effect of how all of these playlists have, helped artists or hampered artists in finding value in their work. So you talk about what's called perfect fit content, which a lot of people would see as like, I guess, stock music, mood music created. So you would have these playlists and artists would be contributing to it. And then at some point it became ghost musicians. So let's say you've got this musician who's being hired by a production company or something, and they're being told like, okay, I want you to write 50 songs that correlate to sleeping. So, or like doing your laundry or, driving your car or something. So what was really interesting in that was the creative process. So you had talked about how, they're pretty much charting out the music, they're sending it to whoever to be approved, and then they're going into the studio and recording like up to 10 to 15 songs an hour, which anybody who is a recording artist here would say that's insane.
Yeah, that was, so that's one of the big investigations of the book is into what the public has historically, the past maybe 5-10 years, called like fake artists on Spotify playlists. This practice of Spotify filling out its popular playlists for studying, sleep, but even playlists like bossa nova dinner or deep focus, and filling these with these stock tracks made by artists who don't exist. And I think this is really confused a lot of people for a while. So I often say like at first I really wasn't interested in reporting this story. After the first article I wrote about Spotify in 2017, various people from independent record labels started contacting me saying you should research this because this is like all over Spotify. And to me, it just seemed like maybe like teenagers trying to like game the system or something. And I kind of for a long time felt like stories about individual streaming scammers kind of detracted from the more systemic issues, or what I would say like the systemic grift of the ways in which streaming services and major record labels have manipulated the marketplace in their favor at the expense of independent artists. So it's like what counts as a scam is a big question. But it was clear while reporting the book that independent musicians are really concerned about this. And one of the things, as like someone who tries to sort of report these issues from a pro-artist, pro-labor perspective, is following the stories that mass amounts of artists are, saying are important. So I was like, okay, well, if independent musicians are saying this is important for years now, like I should research this. And yeah, what I found through interviewing people who worked in the music business, former Spotify employees, musicians who have been commissioned to make this work, is that it's actually like not DIY hustlers gaming the system, but actually an internal practice of licensing music from these production companies that then commission musicians to make this music in bulk, that's licensed at terms that are, unfavorable to the musicians making it too. So it was really interesting to me to actually talk to these session musicians, many of whom are working artists, cobbling together a living from various different revenue sources, and understanding that, it's not only that this is a practice that's deceptive to the listener because you are, being recommended this music and you don't know if it's real, if it's fake, if it's AI, if it's a ghost artist, but then also the terms, oftentimes these production companies are doing these buyout deals from artists. And I think that the concept of the buyout deal is especially can be predatory with young people who are just haven't worked with record labels before, maybe don't understand contracts, and it's confusing. But yeah, I think it also, this particular issue raises so many questions about the implications of the reality that, tens of thousands of generative AI tracks are being serviced to streaming services every single day, especially the past few months, multiple times a week, I'll have somebody emailing me, a stranger, a link to a track and saying hey, you wrote a book about Spotify, this is a song that I found on Spotify. Can you tell me if this is real, AI, a ghost artist? This was in my recommendations. What is this? And from my perspective, I don't think that those are questions that anyone should ever have to ask. And it's I think a really, really basic thing that people who care about artist communities and also who care about, shaping technology in the public interest, what we should all agree on is that material that is made using generative AI should be labeled. And I also think that it's not just that, but if you are interfacing with a media platform and you're being recommended a piece of media because of some sort of pre-existing commercial deal that makes it cheaper for the service to recommend you that piece of media, then it should be labeled for similar reasons to why advertisements or sponsored content have always had to be labeled, especially with Spotify, these playlist recommendations have operated under the banner of editorial since the beginning, and I feel there are responsibilities that come when you're recommending music under the banner of editorial.
Yeah, and so, you talk a little bit about these ghost musicians and how a lot of them are just, other independent musicians who are needing more money, so they're going to do this, and they don't necessarily know the implications of what they're doing. They're receiving, maybe lower royalties in exchange for you're going to have a better chance of getting on a playlist, And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how, this idea of affordances, this idea of how technology has shaped the way we interact with music, the way music is created, and Spotify's not the first thing to do this, as you had pointed out in the book. It's with the phonograph, recorded music had to be shorter so it would fit on a record. Mm-hmm. People write music for the radio so it's more upbeat or so it's shorter or whatever, and now people are on TikTok writing snippets of songs and giving them to people to create their own songs, and I think that's really important to know that technology is just continually changing the creative process. But in terms of Spotify specifically, I think that it's also shifted artists into looking at okay, well, how do I write an intro that's gonna hit because if they skip the song after 11 seconds, then it's not going to count as a hit, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really speaks to a broader tendency of the platform era that affects not just musicians, but I also think of it in my work as a writer too, right? Like one of the impacts of streaming on musicians that I think about a lot is just how much data musicians are bombarded with. You know, like when users interface with Spotify, it's through like this main Spotify app, but there's this other app called Spotify for Artists, which is basically this data dashboard that tells artists, this is the song that you got this many plays, and this is where the plays came from, and you know, this is how many times people hit skip on this song. It's like all this data, and I think that in some ways, as a creative person, like kind of, you know, everyone's different. You know, different people will find data valuable in different ways. But from my perspective, like I think that it's really important to try to, as much as possible, like drown out that data. You know, I even think right now it's happening with journalists like on platforms like Substack. You know, for me as a writer, it's like I don't want access to that type of data on my writing because I think it really sort of like, well, as a journalist, I think that it kind of like clouds the journalistic process in some ways to, you know, have access to such granular data. So yeah, I guess, you know, like you were saying, technology has always had an impact on what is possible within its boundaries creatively, or had an impact, you know, on the sound of music. But I do think that there's something really unique in this era in just like how much data artists are always having to kind of like grapple with, or, you know, figure out how much they actually want to let that in or not.
Right, and it doesn't always translate, you know, it's like I'll see an artist that has 1 million Spotify plays, and then I'll go see them play, and there's 50 people at the show, you know, so it's really interesting the way Spotify has reshaped that, you know, just like the idea of what is a hit. Like it used to be a mainstream breakthrough that might make the Billboard charts or something like that, and now it's just this viral streaming moment, or it's this data-driven ladder climb, as you called it. And I think that's really interesting because it kind of asks the question of like, well, how does music endure? How do artists endure? Are artists important anymore, or is it more about just like that moment that's being captured?
One thing that I do think is really important, especially for, you know, those of us who really care about independent music or consider ourselves like concerned with protecting independent music, which I feel like independent music is actually mostly just like all music, but is that, you know, like being firm in acknowledging how easily manipulated these metrics are and how little they have to do with value, and like how little streaming numbers, whether it be like monthly listeners, number of streams, like, you know, this is not a way of determining musical value. I've had so many artists, you know, on this book tour want to talk to me about how frustrating it is that even on like a small scale level, venue bookers are looking at their Spotify metrics to, you know, determine whether or not they're going to like let someone book a show at their venue. And I think that that is like something that needs to kind of like loudly be rejected as a concept. You know, especially just like, you know, looping back to what we were talking about at the beginning, I think so many people get involved in independent music because it provides an alternative to, you know, those ways of thinking about culture, because it provides spaces for preserving access to small-scale cultural production, and streaming services aren't set up to, you know, value small-scale cultural production. They're set up to value music that scales, music that gets played on loop in the background, or music that, you know, like you said, goes viral for some other reason. So I think, you know, part of reckoning with what it even means to support independent music, culture, or music in general kind of has to do with, yeah, like minimizing the extent to which we let that kind of like thinking through metrics influence how we think about what matters.
Right. And speaking of metrics, it's pretty common knowledge that Spotify is one of, or possibly the worst platform in terms of how it pays artists. So
Oh yeah.
tell me a little bit about the pro rata model and how it's very biased against independent artists.
Yeah. Well, I should say, so the way in which artists are paid from streaming is basically the same across all streaming platforms. And the easiest way of explaining it, and it's very complicated, that's why it's chapter 13 of my book, not chapter 1, even though like my impulse is to kind of like root this conversation in like a really like material basis talking about economics. I think if the first chapter of this book was explaining the pro rata model, no one would read it. But in the streaming era, artists aren't paid per stream, and they're also not paid directly. They're paid through this system called pro rata, which is this really complicated revenue share model that's based on market share, or what streaming services call stream share. So the basic way of understanding it is that like to get your music on a streaming service, you have to go through a rights holder, and payments are made every royalty period to rights holders. So for example, a record label, the major record labels all have contracts with streaming services. So if you're Universal Music Group and within a royalty period, your catalog accounts for 40% of total streams on the platform, then you would be entitled to 40% of the streaming revenue per the terms of your contract. And it is like common knowledge that major record labels have worked out better deals for themselves, like, you know, small, like percentage-wise, than even like bigger independent record labels are able to command. But just like the whole concept of musical value being based on market share or stream share, I think also like really warps a sense of, like what matters, or how we think about the value of music, and is just kind of also kind of at the heart of what makes this model so antagonistic to art.
It looks like we don't have much time left.
Okay.
I wanted to talk a little bit about solutions, but maybe some people will have some questions about that later. The one thing I want to talk about real fast, Kansas City has a pretty robust music scene. We have a great art scene here, but I feel like on a lot of levels it's not necessarily valued by the city, and it's not valued by the community at large because they just simply don't know about it. So, I think a lot of the way we can push back is through like this grassroots level work. So, how would you suggest a smaller city, music city, could help improve conditions for artists?
Well, I'm glad that you brought up public funding, because there's definitely a part at the end of the book where I talk about, like so many of the problems with the way that music is valued have to do with like not just streaming, but sort of like the fact that we rely so much on just like the music industry to value music. And, towards the end of the book, I write music is too important to be left solely to the marketplace. And we have to also be thinking about, public funding for the arts. We have to be thinking about, I write a lot in the book about ways that public libraries can and do support music. Public library systems around the country and Canada that have started local music streaming services of their own. I talk about different cooperative alternatives that music communities have built or are building to create digital infrastructure outside of the corporate music business, in addition to talking about unions and solidarity organizations that are also, I think, doing good work trying to fight to make streaming less exploitative for everyone who it impacts.
Well, I want to thank you so much for all of this. There was so much I didn't know about it, and as a person who tries to be pretty up on the music stuff, there's just so much there, and it's so rich, and I could probably talk to you for another 2 hours about it, but I won't bore you all. But yeah, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
I believe we're going to do a Q&A next.
Yeah, so we're going to open it up to questions. We've got the microphones at the end of each aisle. If you could do us a favor and not line up in the aisles just to keep it clear for folks. But if you have a question for Liz or Michelle, please come up and ask your question. We'll do this for about 10 to 15 minutes, depending on how many questions we have.
First of all, I want to thank you very much for coming, very much for writing this book. It says a lot of things in very clean and organized ways that I've been thinking and feeling for a very long time. And one of the things I think that it really brought home for me is there's a category of music that I just don't feel, and it's like bands, like it's a vibe band. And so much, I've never been able to figure out why it is that these bands, Michelle's looking at me, it's none of your bands, but there are bands, local bands even, that are like all about the vibes, and I just can't feel that. And then reading the book, I realized, well, these are bands that have been sold, this is how you have to succeed. This is what a vibe playlist is. This is how you need to write to be on this vibe playlist. You need to do this over and over, and that's where you're going to find success. And those are the bands that all of a sudden I'm like, oh, it's those bands. Those are the bands that I see and say, I just don't get it. What's the point? And the answer is, it's not a point about art. It's not a point about expression. It's a point about commerce. And, damn the man and damn capitalism. But just that aspect that you've brought home so well in the book really just opened for me. Of course, that's exactly what it is. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I feel like it can start to feel sort of like, you can start to feel like a conspiracy theorist. But when you have streaming platforms that part of their financial model is extracting data about, your listening habits, extracting data about moods and vibes, like it kind of makes sense that they would prioritize music where there is a easily legible way of fitting into one of those boxes. So I think it's as much about like what type of music has been incentivized and rewarded like by these sorts of media structures, and all the more important to try to remind people the importance of seeking out and supporting music outside of just these currently like status quo ways of listening to music. Thanks.
Thanks again for coming. Spotify is, of course, a delivery medium. And I'm wondering what analogy, actually got two questions. But the first one is, and I'll ask both of them and sit down. First one is, when you think about like Clear Channel, other aspects of the music business, Clear Channel, Ticketmaster, those other aspects that I believe many of us are aware of, what analogies do you see to those? It seems to me like a great deal of this is about concentration. And my second question, trying to get us all to think, as you've alluded to, think a little more positively, what disruptors, because of course technology, that industry thrives on disruption. What disruptors do you see for Spotify on the horizon?
Well, I absolutely agree that I think it's really useful to think about streaming, in the context of media consolidation more broadly, and not even just media consolidation, but also kind of like financialization, I think is also another like helpful framework for thinking about it. But yeah, like I said at the beginning too, I think when you start thinking about these as media issues or media justice issues, they make a lot more sense. And then in terms of disruptors, I mean, I think if you look at like the sort of music industry right now, there's definitely like a lot of concern about generative AI and the implications that will have for streaming services. But what I would prefer to see as disruptors for Spotify are like the burgeoning music labor movement and the ways in which hopefully musician organizing will be disrupting the ways in which music streaming services pay artists in years to come. So there's a bill right now called the Living Wage for Musicians Act that has been introduced by this group called United Musicians and Allied Workers in collaboration with Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. And it is a bill that would create a new streaming royalty that goes around the rights holders, around record contracts, that goes directly from streaming services to recording artists by essentially, I mean, they say it's not a tax, but it's like kind of tax on advertising revenue. So yeah, that's the disruption I'd like to see, is streaming services being forced through regulation to pay artists more directly.
Hi, Liz. Hi, Michelle. Great conversation today. So my question, and I don't mean to generalize, but probably everyone who's here today is either a music person, a book person, already concerned, some version of that. When I'm talking to other people and raising points from this book that I've learned as someone who's deeply concerned, kind of distilling it down, catching their attention, why should they care in a concise way about why they aren't hearing diverse music in their daily listening?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, music is so vast and people listen to music for so many different reasons, but I think that one of the reasons why people listen to music is to connect with other people, communities, to learn about the world, to be exposed to like new ideas. So I think, one of the hopes of a book like this is that people remember the importance of being a curious listener. So I would say that if people are interested in either like remaining curious listeners, have, a goal of music being part of how they approach the world with curiosity, then you would hope that someone would care about musical diversity. But also in order for music to keep existing as an art form, we have to, support music that's made by more than just, something I always say is that the current track that the music landscape is on, if it is allowed to continue without any sort of legal or governmental regulation, if we don't imagine alternatives completely, then music just risks becoming a hobby for rich people. And I don't think that any of us wants to exist in a world where music is just a hobby for rich people, or some might argue that that's what independent music is now, and we should aspire for music to be something that is more accessible and diverse than just that.
Well, and really quick, this was something I wanted to bring up in the conversation, but we didn't get to, is you had brought up the idea of the mixtape and how, these algorithmic playlists sort of try to say they're the answer for the mixtape. But at the same time, I remember making mixtapes and mix CDs with friends, and we put a certain theme together, and it would always be so interesting what everybody would choose, and it would be this connective thing that we'd have. But at the same time, you don't really feel that with the algorithms. You feel like more isolated because it's so hyper personalized. It's like, I don't know what anybody else is listening to, and it doesn't really matter because this is what's coming to me, So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think so much of personalized algorithmic recommendation, just it's not only music is taken out of its intended context and recontextualized in this kind of, risk management way of keeping you streaming and keeping you as a streaming subscriber, but also it just totally erodes and waters down the social connections that could come from music, even if it's just kind of knowing this one person recommended this one song for this reason and understanding where it's coming from, or knowing, what other people are recommended and how what you're recommended relates to what other people are, something I write about a lot in the book is way in which personalization sort of creates a very alienated way of discovering music or hearing music.
Absolutely.
Hi, Liz. Hi, Michelle. As both of you have experience in radio, my question is, how has streaming and podcasting really affected the medium of radio, and how do you think it's going to affect it further down the road?
Well, it's interesting because I actually feel something that is really exciting to me right now is the kind of resurgence of interest in internet radio and community internet radio. So, things in New York, we have this station called The Lot Radio or NTS, these sort of internet radio stations that I think have emerged as not just independent radio stations, but hubs of independent music community and culture too. I was just in Brussels last week and I got to visit this radio station called Kiosk Radio. It's kind of their, it's a independent radio station run out of a kiosk in a public park where people gather to sort of listen to people DJ. And to me, these sorts of and I know there's other cities around the world that have similar things going on. To me, they kind of reflect not just like the maybe like exhaustion that people have with discovering and listening to music solely online, but also kind of the resourcefulness of DIY scenes, and also how I don't know how much social value is wrapped up in like listening to one person select music together with other people, and that's something that is exciting to me. I always recommend to people this app called Radio Garden, where you can like, there's like this globe that you can traverse and listen to independent community and FM radio from around the world, and it also to me represents such like a different way of thinking about what is possible using the technology and like the digital world to share music digitally. It's like, from my perspective, none of the problems with streaming have to do with like universal access to music. Like I think that's universal access to music is a really good thing for society. Nothing to do with like suggesting that we couldn't be doing more interesting things with the internet or technology to create more experiences of sharing music that actually like think about music as like a cultural commons and trying to preserve that through how we interface with music digitally. So yeah, it's just, there are more imaginative ways that we could be sharing music digitally. And I think that online radio is kind of like one of the spaces where some of that more like imaginative thinking is happening.
Yeah, and I'll just say, from the non-commercial radio side of things, I just got back from it's called the Non-Convention in Philadelphia, and it was pretty much a gathering of all of these stations that are like the Bridge. So we're called AAA radio. So we don't play a certain format. We play a lot of different kinds of music, and each station kind of programs, whatever they think their city is into. So like we're very much more on the indie side, but we also play country, we play rap, we play hip hop, we play pretty much everything. And some of that is commercial, like the bigger artists, but we also are very, very focused on local artists. And, right now there has been talk by the current administration about defunding NPR, PBS, a lot of these types of stations that help fund and drive what we're doing, a lot of our content. So it was really heartening, though, to hear about it because, we're all talking about how Spotify isn't necessarily our competitor. Because we are all trying to be so focused on the community. What do people in our city want to listen to? What kinds of shows do they want to go to? So we want to be as hyper-focused on serving our community because that is what we do as public media stations. And one thing you said, and I'll keep it brief, but you said that in your book that Spotify's main competitor is silence.
Yeah, I did quote a former employee who talked about, like a meeting where the executives were talking about how that is what they considered their competition to be. And I feel like, their end game is just have you playing music in the background all day. So that is like a pretty different, proposition or offering than what a local public radio station offers. But I do think that, so many of the conversations that I have around the book end talking about the importance of local independent radio, actually, or community radio or public radio. And I think it really makes sense because of what we were talking about earlier. Like, streaming wasn't just pitched as a replacement for the record store, but also for a replacement for radio. It always gets talked about in this context, like streaming, it's just the new radio, but it's also where artists are to monetize their music. And I think that that's kind of one of the issues with it is that, these are different concerns. So having a conversation about how to revalue music financially is important, but also about how to revalue music like socially and revalue music in local communities. And I think that independent radio plays a big part of that.
Another sort of comment, but also question. I'm a native son of Kansas City. I've been listening to music here for more than 50 years. And from where I sit, we're living in, if you look at the quality and breadth of music that most music lovers have access to Michelle's point, we've got an amazingly robust live music scene here. I got to believe that's what you experience in Brooklyn. But then there's also these, I would call them dark clouds that are with these other elements. And how concerned are you that these dark clouds are, as a music lover, are going to kind of kill the golden goose, which begins with what? Because until that artist picks up that instrument and starts creating, Clear Channel, Ticketmaster, Spotify, without that art form, there's no need for those. And how concerned are you that it's going to kind of kill this golden goose of this age of music in which we're living?
You know, I try to not be like overly alarmist or to like sensationalize, because the music industry has always been incredibly corrupt. Independent musicians have always been contending a lot with the music industry has always been really exploitative. But I do, think that currently it's not just that the music industry is really exploitative, and that the pairing of the exploitative record industry with the exploitative technology industry together have created like new forms of enclosure and extraction of music that I think reason for writing this book is that I think it really, really needs to be grappled with in order for music to continue to exist as an art form. But try not to be alarmist, but I do think that, in previous eras, it was also important to, when new technologies arise, like there need to be not just like new laws and regulations for them, but there also need to be like new practices that emerge in order to offer suitable alternatives that really kind of like grapple with power in that moment. So I think that like currently we both are in this moment where we need to be thinking about, okay, there's these new, not just new technologies, but new types of partnerships between really old industry practices and really new industry practices that are figuring out all these new ways of exploiting listeners and musicians. And how can we like rein this in? How can we like try to minimize corporate power in this way that it is manifesting? How can we try to minimize the exploitative tendencies of these companies? And then also, how can we, create alternative networks, alternative systems, ways of supporting grassroots music that really sort of like meet the moment, I guess. Because I think that it's not just that you need like new laws for new technologies, but also our frameworks for like independent music or community music or DIY music also, I think, need to be updated to kind of like think about the different types of power that artists are up against now.
All right, we're gonna leave it there. And let's give them a round of applause. That was incredible. We're gonna have a book signing in the lobby, so if you got a book and you wanna get your book signed, come through to meet Liz. We also have a survey of QR codes coming up on screen for you to access. If you want to see some live music this Sunday, check out Michelle's band Frog Pond at the Truman. They are opening for the Toadies. You can check that out. But once again, let's give them a hand.